I'm Adam Barrett. I work at a company name called Batovi in Chicago. I work as a JavaScript developer and consultant. I love the web. I love JavaScript, and I love talking about things. So I'm just trying to do these talks to try and sort of help other people learn more, help myself learn more, and sort of become a better speaker for it. I've been told I rush too fast, so I'm very consciously trying to slow down through this whole thing. So if I don't get to the end of my slides, no big deal, because we're all just friends here, chatting, talking about some cool things. So, should be all right. Yeah, I feel like I was going to miss something, but I'm going to be honest with you all. Actually, before I even start with this, I'm going to be honest with you all. In an attempt to sort of, have full circularity, I wrote all my slides in web components, which I am totally regretting now, because the way it works, there's no way in heck that anybody is going to be able to read them. So when the code pops up and you guys can't read it and you're squinting, I apologize. I would like to fix it, but I won't be able to. So I'm just going to talk a lot about what's actually up there. And the other point is, this is just a taste. This is the intro to web components. I'm going to talk about web components. I'm going to maybe talk about, the whys and the what. But if you really want to learn how to use web components, you have to come to my next talk, which is apparently going to be on the 29th. The word is it's going to be at the German Club. Don't quote me on that. It might be somewhere else. I just know it's not here and it's not at the museum.
Yeah, I'm not sure yet either.
Yeah, not sure of the location, but
so it might be at Sasto.
I have no idea, to be honest. But I
more
think
likely it would be the German Club, but
probably
anyways,
the German Club. Thursday the 29th, where we'll actually talk about how to use them, some best practices, that kind of stuff. But now, let's start with, oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. The first one is free. The second one is also free. Okay, so here's my intro to web components. Let me begin by showing you a simple app. This is not web components. Here's my simple app. Hopefully you guys can see this. All it is videos of cuteness. So I can select a video, and it will play a video, presumably. Or maybe not. Let's try a different one.
yeah, the Wi-Fi might not be.
It's not over the network. It should be right on the thing. So it's just gone. That's really going to be unfortunate. All right.
Yeah, we still wanted the cuteness.
Get out of here.
Well, it's still better than the old Microsoft blue screen of death presentation.
Oh, videos of cuteness not working. Not sure why. Okay, well, this is even more horrible than I could imagine, but all right, here's, pretend these are videos playing of a really cute little girl, my daughter, playing and stuff like that, and being cute. There you go, here's one.
Yay.
Oh yeah.
Let's try Princess. Anyway, this is as simple as an app it can get. You select a video, it plays automatically. I wonder what's on.
We saw some.
Oh, let's go to the next slide. Get out of here. Ooh. Almost.
Gets it to click again for it to appear.
There we go. All right.
Aww.
Here's my simple app. Anyways. Sorry. But this simple app has hidden complexities. So, I mean, all it really was a drop down and a video, right? But it's got this, UI for single selection. It really only allows you to choose one thing. It's got sort of that little drop down, little check mark. It's got a custom selection for mobile. If you were on mobile and you did this, it's like the whole pop-up thing. I don't know if you guys see selects how they kind of draw themselves on iPhones. There's binary data I/O for actually fetching these binary video files and playing them in the web browser. There's keyboard accessibility for both the choosing and the controls on the video player itself. The video player has play, it has a scrubber, it has play and pause. It's got the video time there. It actually reads the metadata from the file and it figures out how much time there is left and where you are at it. It's got system volume control, so it actually controls the volume of the system from here. and it's got a full screen option. So this is actually a really complex UI. It just looks like a really simple little app. Now here's the entirety of the HTML that's used to produce this. And it's really hard to see, but essentially there's all the stuff you have to put, just wrapping, HTML, the header, and then it's got a body. And all it is a select, a bunch of options with values equaling the video names, and then a video. And then there's a little bit of JavaScript on the main there that loads at the bottom. And this is the entirety of the JavaScript for that app. It's just, again, way too small to see. Sorry about that. But it basically just gets a variable called video, gets the DOM element, puts it in there. Variable called select, gets the DOM element of the select, puts that in there. And then adds a listener to the select, says when I change, set the video's source. That's all it does. And then it causes one change event right off the bat, just to like load the first one automatically. So that's it. The entirety of the app written right there, and it has all this hidden complexity just built right in. So why is this so easy to write? Is it because I'm cheating? Yeah, sort of. It's because I use built-in elements of the browser. I mean, the video tag from HTML5, it took a long time to come, but it's pretty much in the browser. It did most of this, right? And the select, I mean, that's been around forever, but it's a really, fundamental UI. It's got single select. It's got all these little options. You can even throw multi on it and make multi-select. There's a lot of stuff. Built-in elements of the browser are awesome to use because they have this, it's an abstraction. And it's complex UI with an easy-to-use interface. It's got this declarative thing. I just throw a tag on the page, say, this is a video. It's got a source or multiple sources. I want this to autoplay and I have controls. Really easy. You just literally write that out. It's got events that happen. When it starts playing, it sends it this event. I've started playing it. When it stops, I've stopped. Video just does that for you. You can bind, hook onto these events. Same with the select. It's got this change event. Every time you select a new one, it just says, hey, I changed. Hey, I changed. So you can say, oh, find the value it changed to, and now set the source of my video. And then it's got some default styles. You saw the controls there. They're kind of different amongst browsers, but generally, there's default styles that happen. And they're somewhat customizable, possibly. The encapsulation of these browser built-in elements is great. Even though there's buttons, like a play button and a pause button on the video, if I style buttons on my page, I don't affect that little button, not unless I want to. If their buttons don't cause me to suddenly be able to select, if I do a query selector all for buttons on my page, I don't accidentally get the one from the video because it's all encapsulated in their little element. So there's encapsulation and modularity in these built-in elements. So that's what makes them awesome and makes them easy to use. But they're fairly limited, right? I mean, we have select, you can barely style it. It doesn't really do what you want all the time. Video is pretty good, but it's like the newest one pretty much. So it's got a little bit of customizability. But these built-in elements, they're available there. They have no external dependencies, and they all have this standard interface that I talked about where you assign them attributes and things change, and they cause events to tell you stuff that you can hook into. It's like a standard interface, attributes and events. So then, what if I told you that you could augment the browser with your own custom elements, your own elements, and they would have all the cool things that the built-in ones do. Well, what are webcam ones? So the ability to augment the browser with new custom elements and easily reuse and share those elements with others. And that's really all they are. I mean, there's going to be a lot of talk about, the technologies involved. There's, shadow DOM and templates and all these things. And that's true, but really what it boils down to is you're going to be able to make these built-in things, these complex UIs with, abstracted into easy-to-use interface say, hey, browser, this is how it acts, and this is what it does. So imagine what you could do. You'd have these, like I just said, complex UIs with this standard interface. Everybody knows that they're going to be sending events. Everybody knows how to declare these. You just write them on the page. My element, my dash element, and you apply some attributes by writing them in. You hook into them using add event listener. They're shareable, so you could just I could make a really cool one and give it to somebody else, and then they could use it. So just like the video tag, except I've made my video tag. It's even better. It's awesome. It's got some cool things. It has a chat that talks 2 ways or something, and I can just say here, now you guys can use it, and you can use it, and because you know that it's got this standard interface of events and attributes, it's easy to use. And then they're extendable too. So you can take a button, for example, and say this button is actually a different kind of button. It's a new fancy button that has special behavior, and now it'll be at the new button. So that's kind of a either here or there right now. And then, yeah, they're both declarative and imperative APIs. So just like all the built-in ones, you can just write a tag on the HTML page and say this is an element, you know, my custom element. It's got these things. Or you can say create element, new my custom element, and then, you know, element dot set attribute, and set attributes that way. There's both the imperative and the declarative API. So if web components, this is my analogy, is if web components, if DOM elements were like Lego pieces, that you pretty much take all the DOM elements and you stack them up to build your app, and you sort of have this, you know, an overall app system that combines them and makes sure that they react to each other in some sort of model layer that, whatever. Well, they're Lego pieces. Then web components would basically be the 3D printer that lets you make all the cool new Lego pieces that you couldn't have used before. And they can make sure that they interact with these ones perfectly, but you can make whatever you want.
Excuse
So,
me.
yeah.
What does DOM stand for?
DOM is Document Object Model. So if you're ever programming in HTML, basically what HTML does is it gets parsed and then turned into all these DOM objects, this document object, and then there's little pieces throughout it. It's like a tree with nodes on it and stuff. A Google Map component. Has anyone here ever added a Google Map to a web app? Anybody find that frustrating or a little confusing even?
At times, yes.
It's not dead simple, which is, I mean, it's not really hard. So I threw in some stuff. Here's like the minimum, and this is like, I think in their example even, this is the minimum it takes, and it's not a lot, and I'll admit, it's fully comprehensible, it's fully fine, but it just seems like a little too much. So basically you can't see this, I'm sure it's too small, but basically on the page, you have to have a little place for it, so you give it an ID or whatever. There's got to be a div that's going to be like, I'm going to hold this map. And then you style the map, make sure that it's got the right layout. And then you include the Google Maps, the Google APIs, specifically the map one. Then you have to have a little bit of JavaScript that runs. You have to define sort of a callback. In this case, I defined a function called initialize. And in that initialize, you use the Google global variable, and it'll have a bunch of namespaces on it. In this case, google.map, which then has some like variables on it and some functions and stuff that you have to use. And this is the minimum you need to do to make a map and have it pointed a place. These two things right here. And that seems like a fine amount. It gets more complex if you want to add pointers and you want to add little map pins and stuff. But that's the basics. That seems like a lot. But if Google Map is a component, which it now is too, they've actually, Google released a bunch of stuff componentized, this is all you'd have to do. So you have a link, rel import, which I'll talk about later, but that imports the Google Maps component, and then you just use it. You throw this tag, Google Maps, set latitude and longitude here, set the minimum zoom level to 9, set the maximum to 11. Boom, done. You have a Google Map on your page. And then you can add things in there too. That's just the most basic form. So then take this idea of how these, how you augment your browser with custom elements, and then you sort of expand that and think about, okay, well, what kind of things would I build? So imagine building your apps like this. Now, I'm sure that's too small, but essentially it's just this. There's a body, and it's got a property called is, and that property is set to app layout. I won't get into too much of that, but basically it allows you to solve a lot of your like CSS problems and your layout problems declaratively with HTML, rather than having to deal with all that kind of stuff. Then it's just got a header, a main, a couple of asides, and a footer, just like you'd expect. This is all very easy to understand, easy semantic. And in there it's got, there's one in the main, it's got a chart. In one of the asides, it's got a chart filters custom element. And in the other side, it's marked secondary, it's got groups and a select box custom element. And then in the footer, it's just got a data table custom element, which presumably would get populated with through some sort of like JavaScript. And then some JavaScript below that. And what that ends up doing is making something like this. So this is not fully interactive right now, but basically, so just this little thing. All this stuff is just laid out exactly how you'd expect it to. Simple. If you were to look at the same page built with, say, like, jQuery plugins, or some other kind of frameworks, even Angular without using proper directives, this really doesn't look like this at all. It'll have a bunch of extra little divs and spans and all sorts of things just to make it look like it. Like if you use Bootstrap, you just see all your little extra divs, extra classes, extra spans. This just is simple and easy to understand what's going on. So like, to look at it again, it's just got the chart and it's got the data sort of laid out as attributes. It's got some options that are just right there for you. It's value USA and Canada, and boom, USA and Canada. And then it handles this mobile responsive design thing just sort of naturally because of that body being an is app layout body, which is just a special kind of extended body. So you can make complex applications composed from small independent components tied together with a little bit of app logic. And the app logic is fairly simple too, because it's all sort of the stuff you'd expect. Events from your custom elements get tied to do something, and maybe they're going to change a model, or maybe they're going to cause some sort of action. And then you assign attributes to the custom elements to make them do other things. Simple, and it's standard, and it's across the board. And because it's standard and it'll be implemented in all browsers, all the frameworks and libraries that you use can use web components. So Ember can yeah.
When you say all the browsers,
Yeah.
are you including IE?
Well, and if we want to get into browser support, technically right now, none of the browsers actually fully support web components. That's not true. Google fully supports web components, but I think there's going to be a change on imports. But I'll talk about that later. But when I say all the browsers, I mean someday this will be supported in all the browsers. There we go. And that's the important part about web components. This is the future. This is the way you're going to code. You can code in it now. I could get into it a little more later, but basically they wrote some great polyfills, which you can get at webcomponents.org. And they basically allow IE 10 and up, and most evergreen browsers, so most of all the current versions of all the big browsers, to work and have web components work mostly. There's a couple of caveats to do with CSS, because you really can't fake that encapsulation, that CSS encapsulation that true web components offer, but it works pretty well with some caveats. And you can just start programming it right away. So if you only care about IE 10 and up, or you're doing like an internal app, or you're doing like a hybrid mobile app, or a WebKit, Node WebKit kind of desktop kind of thing, you should totally start using web components. It'll help in every way. And oh yeah, I was going to say, so because it's standard like this, the interface is going to be standard and whatever. Libraries can then use them, and so everybody can sort of have these widgets, or whatever you want to call them, in their frameworks, and they can just be reused. See, right now, if you try and use like jQuery plugins with your Angular app, and then somebody writes something really cool for Ember, a really cool widget, it's not impossible, but it's a lot of work to make all these things work together. But if they were all using this web component standard interface, well, then that Ember one, well, you can just throw that in the app. It'll just work, because it works like all the other ones. And the one that's powered by jQuery plugin, well, that'll work too, because it'll be a web component fully now. And so, anyway, it'll solve a lot of that. Oh, that's awesome! I'd love to use that, but I can't get it into our app, or it'll be too much trouble. So some benefits of using web components is it makes sharing these complex UI components easy. It keeps CSS safer and sane, and I can get into why in a bit. And these predictable APIs of events and attributes just make everything. When you get a new web component, you don't have to I wonder how to use this. You know pretty much the basics at least. You know it's going to send off events. You know you're going to assign attributes to it. And then there's sort of that prototype API that it'll be like, oh, is there a video method, or is there a data method that I add? But predictable APIs at least. How are we doing for time? I don't actually have a watch on this thing. 12:45.
33.
Oh, lots of time. Great. So, hopefully you're interested in web components right now. Hopefully I've got, you whet your appetite for this at least. So how do we create web components? How do we augment our browser with new UI elements? Well, to do that, we're going to have to tell the browser, we're going to have to describe to the browser in code what the underlying data should look like what state it should hold, if any, and blah, blah, blah. How it should render to the screen, and how it should behave, when a user interacts with it, or when it gets events called on it, or something happens, time goes by, it needs to know how to behave. So we need like a language or something that can do all that, can describe, what the data should look like, how it should render, and how it should behave. If only we had a stack of technologies that did something like that, right? It's like, oh, right, of course. So how do we create web components? We augment the browser using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we use the stuff that we already know to augment the browser because that's what we know. So I've seen a lot of other talks start with the 4 pillars. I hope I did a better job by not starting with this. But there's basically the 4 pillars of web components. These are the technologies that browsers are going to have to add to their browsers so that web components as a concept work. I should maybe explain that, but I'll come back to it. So there's custom elements. Now I've been sort of interchangeably using custom elements and web components. But technically, custom elements, the ability to just assign custom elements, is only a part of web components. Meaning, you could have a custom element that isn't a web component. But in order to have a web component, it'll be a custom element, if that makes sense. Web components are a subset that need to meet more criteria than just being a custom element. But that custom elements needs to be implemented in the browser. You need to be able to register, hey, this is a custom element, it has special behavior, look up what that special behavior is, and then execute it. Templates. It's actually just a helper thing, but it'll work. Shadow DOM, which is very cool, and probably have to do a whole new talk on Shadow DOM. It's a little more. And HTML imports, which we'll talk about. And all these technologies are used to make web components, but they're all easily fine to use on their own. Web components are a concept more than they are like a thing that you do. So you can use custom elements and just make custom elements that aren't web components. You can use Shadow DOM in any browser that supports it and not be making web components. You're just making easier to encapsulate CSS solutions or something.
Adam?
Yeah.
Just one question, then. Can you give an example of a custom element that would not be a web component so we can keep that clear as
The biggest thing would be a web component implies the modularity and the modularity and whatever that word is, of not breaking into other things. So you can have a custom tag that just exists and maybe has its own. Actually, what would be a good example? You could have a custom tag that, once defined, sort of injects itself with a bunch of divs and stuff and puts a little style tag in there. And unless it prevents wrecking other things, like if I now do a query selector all and I get all those divs, well, that's not really a web component because I've affected the rest of the page. I may have added things, and I may have had, I'm not doing a very good job of describing this.
it's not a self-contained unit.
It's not self-contained, exactly. And so it's not a component, and therefore can't be composed into bigger things easily without wrecking stuff. And it's kind of what we have now. So it's but it is the crux of web components, like I said, custom elements. This is sort of how, if you can see that, you basically there's a method on document that's going to be added, or is added in Chrome, and you can polyfill for some other ones. I think it's on the box behind a flag. Register element, and it takes a string, which is like the name of your element, and the name has to be a valid name, and they've decided in all their great wisdom that a valid name is going to be a name that includes a dash. So web components must include a dash. That's to separate it from native components, which will not have a dash, like div and video. And if it's my dash video, okay, you've got a custom component. Easy way to do that. It used to actually be X dash, but then somebody realized that's not cool. It's way cooler to let people like namespace their stuff and such. And then it takes a prototype. Then it takes an object that describes certain things. Right now, the only one that they've decided on is prototype, and it's going to pass in the prototype of your new element. And so your new element must have a prototype itself. Your new element's prototype must also point to the HTML element prototype. So you have to object.create or have a constructor function that has the prototype that is the HTML element, or inherit, which is the wrong word, but you have to inherit from HTML element. So here's, they're also going to implement some life cycles. Right, I forgot about this. Some life cycle callbacks that you can add to your prototype that will then happen at certain stages of of your custom element. So there's the created callback, the attached callback, the detached callback, and the attribute change callback. And these are sort of crucial for deciding on the behavior of it. So the created obviously will happen when you create a new element. So you can instantiate stuff, do whatever you need to do, set default state. Then there's the attached callback, and that'll happen when it gets put into a DOM tree. So you create something and then you put it into a DOM tree. That's when the attached event happens. And that's probably a good time to attach event listeners if you need to, or other things. A detached, it's a good time to clean up. You know, any event listeners you added, it's a good time to remove them so you don't have leaks. And then there's attribute change, and that's sort of the fundamental thing. You're going to know when an attribute gets changed through that set attribute, that standard element set attribute method. And then you can react to it and change accordingly so that you can maintain that standard interface. Templates, this is the second pillar. Templates are not that complex and not that interesting, but they are part of the thing. Basically, the old way was, do something like this. You'd have script with a special type that wasn't JavaScript, so that you could just access that as a string, and then somewhere later you'd like inner HTML, throw it in, or use jQuery to turn it into DOM elements. Template just sort of gives a standard browser way of doing this. Whatever you put in a template tag is, I think I have this on the next page, it's inert. It will not, I wrote right here, image and media will not download, scripts will not execute, nodes will not be added to the DOM tree. It's just completely inert what's in there. But what you can do is import that node or clone that node, and then you've got a real node, and it'll start doing all those things, and then you can put that in wherever you need. So basically, the solution that we've already been using with scripts and stuff is a standard way and sort of easier to use. It'll give you a Docker fragment when cloned, not a string, which is a little different than the way the script tag used to work. And it can't be traversed into, that's the other thing. If you do a query selector all, you won't find anything in a template tag. Shadow DOM is the magic that powers web components. You get it by calling this create shadow DOM method on an element. And all it does is it's basically going to, I think I have this on the next slide. It provides encapsulation by creating a tiny document within that element. And that document doesn't spill out into the other stuff with its own DOM tree and its own rendering rules. So styles do not escape from the shadow DOM. So whenever if you have CSS rules and you can use IDs and stuff, they won't escape the shadow DOM. Styles don't penetrate the shadow DOM, meaning like if you have page level styles, they're not going to go into your shadow DOM and change those styles too. Finally solving that ridiculous problem where I changed one button and somewhere else in my app that I wasn't even thinking about buttons changed too. JavaScript doesn't traverse into the shadow DOM. If I do query selector all, and I might find my element, but I'm not going to find all the little special divs and secret sauce spans that I put in there to make the rendering look correct. JavaScript doesn't traverse out of the shadow DOM. I can't like accidentally grab all the, all the buttons and do something with them from outside of the travel. And then the one caveat to that is, unless you want to. There is an API to do all of that stuff, but it won't happen accidentally, which is great. Shadow DOM is the single most interesting and complex aspect of web components, which is why it deserves its own talk. And so I'm not going to tarry too long on this. Look into it. That's part of this is just a taste. We'll talk more about it at my next talk too. HTML imports are basically, this is the part about sharing, because what are web components without the sharing and reuse concept? And so basically all it is this is sort of how it is. It's a link tag. Rel is import instead of style sheet, which is like the common use for link right now. It's got a ref, and it goes to an HTML file you can see too. And so what this does is, since web components are made up of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, script loading was not enough, CSS linking was not enough. We needed some way to import all of these languages that make up a web component. And so they have HTML imports. It's pretty simple. You put it at HTML and you import that. HTML files can also import other HTML files, which leads to sort of a dependency tree. You can have like, oh, this one imports from other ones, which import from other ones. So you're like, oh, great. You can modularize that way.
Does that mean that the component can have its own style sheet separate from the where it's imported into?
Yes.
And it would just affect that component.
Pardon me?
And it would just affect that component.
Yeah, well, and that's actually a little bit of a trick on that one. because there's this whole thing about where the document is and what document it is. So you can import a style sheet, and it'll work in the way you're sort of expecting, but it's where the URL has to point to gets messed up. And so most people, not everyone, Polymer has a whole thing about using a style sheet, but most people are just using a style tag in their web components because it's easier to manage than using a style sheet separately. And you can do all the same stuff, but it's just in a style tag in an HTML file rather than that you import rather than in a separate style sheet. But that's a whole little side thing. That's more about the URL than it is what I mean. Oh yeah, imports will dedupe other imports. So if you import jQuery from the same URL in like 2 different imports, goes, oh, I got that. We'll just get it once, and you'll get the one back. And it's really the only aspect of web components causing any sort of disagreement or drama right now because Mozilla said they're not going to do it. Mozilla will not ship HTML imports. And why? Because they think that script loading with the ECMAScript 6 modules is going to reveal to us all sorts of new insights as what we should be doing and how we should be importing things and how we should be handling dependency management stuff. So they're just going to hold off on imports right now because they believe the spec's going to change. Chrome already implemented it. The way they think the standard will be, this is possibly where that's going to change. And there's a link to that, which of course you can't click on. And then there's some other technologies that are related to web components, basically object observers. As you can probably read, is good for respond. If you are doing, model-driven views, you can have, your DOM respond to these model changes. Mutation observers, which is basically looking at what happens in the DOM and then responding. It's like the reverse of that. You're looking at the DOM and responding to DOM changes at all. And then CSS variables, which is a funny thing to add in here, but it's true. It'll help with theming. So you can sort of have these web components that'll have theming options, and you can sort of see examples on the web. You can look it up, but CSS variables really help with that because you can sort of set things and have it cascade throughout your whole component and go, oh yeah, with one simple, dark attribute, suddenly I have a dark theme or whatever. Some cool stuff with that. So, like I said, I hope I've whet your appetite for what web components are. Here's some places you can learn more. There's webcomponents.org, which is the best source. It's got the polyfills so that you can, use web components in browsers other than Chrome, i.e. 10 up. There's HTML Rocks. If you just do the search for web components, there's a whole bunch of articles describing the different parts, sort of the concepts as a whole. And then there's my next talk, which should be on Thursday the 29th. Location unknown, probably the German club. Solving problems with web components. Questions? You first.
So I've been learning React
Yep.
in the last few weeks, which is a similar type thing from Facebook. And they're using it live now with, IE8 and up, I think. There's a few differences, but why would you, do you know?
Why would you use sort of standard web components as opposed to React or Angular directives or that kind of thing?
Because I looked at web components when I was trying to figure out what to delve into next, and it just seemed like it was maybe something for the future, but like 6 years.
Okay, so the question is, just, what's the point of web components when you have React or Angular that's already doing this stuff and it works in browsers all the way back to IE8 rather than IE10 up? And I would say nothing's wrong with that. Actually, keep doing that. The frameworks are actually, I think, the ones who are going to benefit the most from web components. There won't be, there will be a lot of sharing, I think, of web components, but frameworks, especially like React and Angular and Ember and CanJS, are all moving towards using web components. So their components, which work now and work well, are going to start using these real web components when they're sort of implemented in more browsers, or they're going to be switching that so that there's this common interface which will simplify framework code. So your application code can still be exactly the same, but the framework code is actually going to end up being a lot simpler. And then you can also have these, the CSS encapsulation and the ability to use an Ember one with your React one with no troubles benefits as well. But yeah, to be honest, if you don't just want to go, I want to try the future, the best advice is if you need stuff that's going to be IE8 and up, you should use Angular or Ember or React or CanJS, because they all do have a component thing with directives, certain type of directives in Angular, but they all have some sort of component thing that is going to flow into this. So there's no benefit beyond that. But At the same time, there's this awesome thing called Polymer, which is a framework that's built specifically for web components, which makes it easier to build web components and gives you a bunch of like built-ins and some cool stuff. That's a really cool option too, but I think that might be IE 10 and up only too. But Polymer is a really neat thing because it's built specifically for web components to make web components building easier and neat. And so Polymer is a cool framework option too, which you should look into. Sorry, question?
A couple of questions, see if we can keep them short. HTML import, the other thing with that, but also because then you have a common navigation, easily imported on multiple files rather than have to use like a dynamic scripting to do it.
Right, so.
There's a question, is that one of the things that can do too?
So you're asking, is HTML imports, is one of the benefits of it that it has a common sort of path awareness so that you can say like, things will always be in the right place when you want to import them? Sure. I mean, right now I see a lot of people using Bower, and it's more, I guess, Bower to share their web components. I think it's more because Bower has a specific structure. So I don't know if it's a feature, but I guess it's like maybe it could help. Might not though.
Okay.
Could help. I don't know if that's a great answer, but sorry.
That helps. And the other question being Shadow DOM. So the other advantage I'm thinking too, something like jQuery, when we may end up using some element defined within that library, the Shadow DOM helps us work around that type of thing. What happens if I use the same name as this other library uses? It doesn't matter because the Shadow DOM looks after that.
So yeah, you're saying if you're using other libraries like jQuery and but they're using Shadow DOM too, you won't run it. You're saying you won't have problems with name collisions or
Yes.
methods. That's right. And Shadow DOM, though part of web components, works by itself too. So Shadow DOM is what really provides that encapsulation. So it'll work regardless of what library you're using and regardless of what framework. Shadow DOM is just cool because it'll stop CSS and JavaScript from interfering with each other and the spaces and whatnot. Was there somewhere up here?
Could you potentially have custom-made scripting and Shadow DOM where the scripting executing in
In the other document, but not.
and then effectively you have
I don't think it changed. Shadow DOM definitely isn't like built for security at all. Like they even sort of state that this has nothing to do with the security model. But I don't think it causes any more problems. I mean, it's still just executing on the same page. It's still, but yeah, it doesn't help prevent any of that kind of stuff. You still have to use the regular web stuff to prevent cross-site scripting attacks and such.
Good. Are there any popular, well-known implementations of using web components right now?
Are there any popular, well-known implementations using web components right now?
Or not, maybe not popular, but notable
Yes.
ones?
Well, there's Polymer, which is Google's sort of thing, and they're using full-on web components, and it's pretty cool and it's a pretty big deal. And they built a bunch of different sites in it, including webcomponents.org and polymer.org, I think it is, or Polymer something. And like I said, Angular 2.0 is built to use them. Like they know it's coming, so it's starting to get into that. Same with React, they know it's coming, so they're figuring out how to make everything work with web components. Because it really is, like this is happening, it's going to move forward. Whether it's going to be useful or not is still yet to be seen, but I believe it's going to be game-changing and it's going to be awesome.
Are there any like apps or websites that like, people are actually building with web components, like not the frameworks, but the
Yeah,
applications
there are.
actually?
I don't know what they are.
Okay.
But there are. I know that like the only one I can think of off the top of my head is webcomponents.org, and they made a Polymer. If you go to the Polymer website, they have a bunch of cool little apps. Like there's this like trivia app and some other things that were all built with web components. But as for like major things, I think most people are still doing that. You know, like if you go to like Walmart or Sam's Club or something, they're using components, but through a library like CanJS or Angular or whatever. So, but there's thinking in component solutions, which is also a big, important deal. Is that it for questions? Great. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something, and I hope you come to the talk, the longer talk, and we'll go more in depth on that.